think broadly, not only like who can become a client of mine, but who can become a strategic partner, who can become a referral partner, who could become a distribution partner, and we could share each other's podcast episodes to increase listenership.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
And welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. It's your host, Adam AAA Adams, with Noah Tetzer. I feel like you're a co-host now because you're hanging out with me 3 episodes in a row. I love it. Well, awesome. Noah is an expert at podcasting. He did some really cool things that you can check out in 2 episodes ago, when he was talking about how he literally moved his podcast up by doing a few things that are shared in that episode that got him to 50,000 downloads per month. The last episode that he was with us, he gave us some really good 6 tangibles that you need if you want to actually monetize. My favorite was the email outreach. Like, if you want to hear him actually read an email that he sent out, that's in the very last episode with Noah. Today, we're talking about generating clients through your podcast. And here's why. Because you want to generate clients through your podcast. It's that simple. Most of us are coaches, mentors. We might have an online course. And it's much easier, I think, to monetize a podcast with your own stuff to sell than to have to worry about all the sponsors. Because then you can control it, and your people already trust you, and you'll be able to probably make more money through being your own sponsor than in many cases your sponsor can make by being your sponsor, which will allow us to be able to talk about getting your own clients. You need to start consulting with those people, and you need to start charging your $50 an hour, $100 an hour, $300 an hour, or your $3,000 a month, or your $20,000 or $50,000 one-time coaching fee just to get in under your doors. And no one better to share that with us than Noah Tetzer. What's up, Noah?
Adam, it is a pleasure to be back with you today.
I'm happy you're here. So let's jump in. We're going to be talking about generating clients through a podcast. What is the framework to do this? What do we need to be thinking? What do we need to be doing? Is it about advertising our podcast? Is it about the messaging? Is it about the calls to action? What do we need to be focused on if we want to actually get listeners to turn into paying clients?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I'll say that I think most people out there, whether you are an agency owner, a consultant, a coach, a mentor, what have you, I think most people out there go about sales in the most painful way possible. So DMing people on LinkedIn, sending out cold emails, paying thousands of dollars to travel to some networking event in the country to hopefully shake hands and grab drinks with people to close a deal. That is the old way of generating leads for your business. Time has changed, my friends. And there's a little thing called content-based networking or podcast-based networking, whatever you want to call it. That is how I've been able to generate clients personally and how I've helped other people do the same. So what it comes down to is this. Instead of reaching out to somebody via cold email or introducing yourself at a conference, what you need to do is take off your sales hat and put on your journalist hat. I've said that before. Invite someone to appear on your podcast. Invite your ideal, hard to reach prospect, the decision maker at a company that you would love to work with. They'd be an ideal client. They're so ideal that if they became a client, perhaps they could even generate 10% of your annual revenue for your business. Those are the kind of prospects I'm talking about. Invite them on your podcast. In your email, mention nothing about your business, not one thing. Just invite them on your podcast, say how much you'd love to feature them on your show, and then make the whole interview about them, make it them centric. So, concrete example, if you are, let's say, a consultant or a coach and you would like to consult with, I don't know, a marketing agency, for example's sake, invite the CEO of the marketing agency to share insights about growing a social media presence on your podcast. After that, you'll have made the whole show about them. And then afterwards, when the 20 minutes or so after the interview or in a follow-up email, it's much easier to go ahead and say, hey, you know what? I found our interview fascinating. Here's what you do for a living. Here's what I do. I would love to collaborate in some way. So it sounds very simple, and I'll get into the nuances in a little bit, but that's the basic framework.
Well, it's already interesting to me. It's something that I've done pretty naturally, or maybe
Right.
I don't know if I think about it the way that I don't know if I have ever really identified this as a strategy, but it is something that I do. It's something that I do frequently. For example, one thing that I have my team doing is reaching out to people who have their podcasts, and I always invite, hey, why don't we do a podcast interview swap or something like that? Mm-hmm. Or I'll be talking to somebody I think that they're interesting, and I'll just ask them lots of questions, kind of like you already mentioned. Most people are going about in the most painful of ways, take off your sales hat and start basically being a journalist, asking the questions. So this is kind of what I've done, and it has actually worked. I just ask questions. How are you doing? What are you doing? And they generally have a thing or two that is like amplified more than anything that I'm doing or anything that I think maybe my listener might be doing. And I say, let me feature you. And strangest thing is, many cases I'll end up doing business with that person. Like they're on my podcast and I might end up doing business with them. So I want to say, like, if you are a real estate investor and you're looking for more passive investors to invest in your company or your real estate, then you can have these passive investors and feature them and feature their stories. How did you get started passively investing? What did you learn the most? What kind of deals are you looking for? And then at the end, you're like, boom, hey, by the way, this is what I do. I'm a syndicator, and this is what you do. You passively invest. I would love to collaborate somehow. Same thing with the podcast on podcasting. Having a lot of the people on my podcast are podcasters themselves, and my company serves podcasters. So it sounds like whatever it is that the listener does for a living, they should be interviewing their exact avatar, right, getting their avatar story, and adding value to the avatar, like helping the avatar feel like they're helping other passive investors or podcasters or whatever it is. I mean, by itself, this idea I love, and it's like I've seen it work. Right. Even maybe I haven't thought into it to the depth that you have. So what else do we need to do, or what other steps help us to be able to monetize our own podcast with our own clients?
Yeah, well, I was the same way, Adam, in that I had been doing this strategy for years. It happened so naturally. And truly, listeners, anybody who has tried this, it's like magic how it works, because you're building relationships with these people and things just happen naturally. But then I sort of identified it as a strategy when I was trying to provide value to listeners on my own podcast, Profit with Podcasting. And I really broke it down for people. And I'm like, okay, so this was common sense to me, but let me break it down for maybe people who are new to podcasting. So one of the things that I will say is maybe you don't have a podcast yet, or you're thinking about starting a new show. It's going to be very tempting for you to interview colleagues on your show instead of ideal prospects. And there's a place for that. It's fine to feature colleagues, but be careful. For example, someone that I work with is a CPA for a living, and his niche is agency owners. If everything was ideal, he would be serving clients who are the owners of agencies, and then he would offer his service as a CPA to save them lots of tax dollars for their agencies. So he hosts a podcast about owning agencies. He hosts a podcast about agency ownership. Does he own an agency himself? No. Does he have expertise with regard to managing a marketing agency? No, but he knows how to ask the right questions and have conversations. So he created that show so that he could connect with ideal prospects. So my own podcast, Profit with Podcasting, my ideal prospects are agency owners, consultants, coaches, marketing executives, so forth. A lot of people in the B2B space. Now, I've had a lot of colleagues on that show for various reasons. A lot of it was just selfishly like connecting with people who I thought were cool. But I have had guests on the show that don't have podcasts, but maybe they can share tips about topics that could relate well to podcasters. Maybe if they're an owner of a marketing agency, they could tell us podcasters how to do PR really well for our podcasts, how to get featured, how to grow a Twitter following, etc. So just be really mindful about how you structure your podcast and remember to connect with those prospects, not always peers.
I love this invite prospects versus colleagues.
Right.
And it makes me think of, and you also said that guy that you were talking about that serves some type
agency
of business
owners,
owner.
yeah.
Okay, agency owner, that he knew how to ask the right questions. And I think that those questions are going to be some of the most critical pieces.
Right.
Like you've got to be asking questions that probably do two things: that add value to the correct audience, super, super important, and that allow you to be able to potentially work with that person. So here's the best example that I can think of. This is because I did a lot of real estate, Noah. So it's like a lot of my world revolves around real estate. So I know I've mentioned it in a couple of our episodes. In fact, the first podcast that I ever had was a real estate podcast, and I sold it like almost 2 years ago. So real estate, always a thing. And I'm thinking of it in those terms because I know a lot of people that get into business or into real estate investing, and they want to be able to grow without their own money, but with other people's money. Get down with OPP, other people's money, right?
Right.
And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to raise as much money so they can close on more deals or buy more apartments or whatever it is. But here's the problem that I'm seeing as you're going through this, Noah. Mm-hmm. They're bringing on guests who have closed on deals before as an operator, not as a passive investor, right, but the operator. And they're asking questions like, how did you operate? How did you find a deal? How did you close that deal? How did you raise the money? In no way does that help them bring on more listeners that want to be a passive investor. It helps add value to listeners that want to operate deals. And secondly, in no way does it help you to gain a passive investor with that guest that you have on, because they're not a passive investor. They could care less. They want to operate the deals.
Right.
And so it's like being careful to invite prospects instead of just colleagues, and to ask the right questions. For example, ask questions about the thing that's eventually going to benefit you and your business, or else you're never going to get those clients or passive investors. You opened up my mind already for a third time in a row, Noah. I love this. So what else, now that we know that we're going to make sure that we're going to be pulley instead of pushy salespeople, take off the sales hat and just add value to people and pull them in. And now we also know that we're inviting prospects, and we also know that we're asking the right questions. What other tangible things can you share with us that allows us to make more money with our podcast through selling our own products and services?
Yeah. I would say think broadly, and just to like provide additional insight to the listeners. So with regards to like timescales, i.e. how long after the podcast interview is it going to take before somebody could actually become a client? Depends. It really depends. Depends on the person, depends on what their maybe marketing goals are for that quarter, depends on their budget, depends on how well they know you. There's no clear-cut answer. I will say from my own experience, generally speaking, when I have connected with somebody and they became a client, after I interview them on a podcast of mine, anywhere from 1 to 6 months is how long it took me before there was actually some sort of contractor, before we started getting the ball rolling. So that's pretty good. And it's a long-term play. It is a long-term play. And think broadly, right? Like, not only like who can become a client of mine, but who can become a strategic partner, who can become a referral partner, who could become a distribution partner. And we could share each other's podcast episodes to increase listenership. Maybe in exchange for you giving them a mid-roll ad for 60 seconds in every podcast episode of yours for 6 months, they could do a feature in their like 50,000 plus contact mailing list or something like that. Just, you can be creative and work out different unique deals like that. And also, like, think of who people know. Like, if you have someone as a guest on your podcast and you ask them, hey, I'm looking for guests, could you recommend 3 people? They're not going to do it 9 times out of 10. They're going to be, oh, let's see, who do I know? And then they forget. But if you can identify who's in their network and say, hey, George, Charlie, so-and-so of this company, I know you guys are connected. I would just relish an introduction. I'd love to feature him on the show. I know he's a good friend of yours. Be really specific. So that's a great way to connect with other ideal prospects in addition to the relationships you're already building. Or maybe the whole purpose of a podcast interview, you have the patience for this, which I do, is getting an introduction to somebody big in your industry.
I really like that. One thing that is beneficial to all of us is that you mentioned that a lot of the times those prospects that you found sometimes can take a month or even up to 6 months before there's a contract in place and you're actually working together, because it allows us to understand that it's not a get rich overnight, not a get rich quick, not a you do it once. It's kind of like, this is your acquisition strategy for client acquisitions. You're constantly interviewing people, and sometimes for the people that connect with you, it's going to take a little while for them to decide that it's the right time for them, that they have enough money now to hire you.
Right.
And it could take 1 to 6 months. And I think that's important. So with podcasting, it's probably a long game for any of us. If we're going to do it, we probably need to be planning on doing it for years, and 1 to 6 months. And I really like that part where you said, think a little bit more broadly. Like, don't just think too cut and dry, like only interview just your prospect only or whatever, but additionally interview maybe 2 other types of people. Or sorry, I'm saying it slightly wrong, because one, it was like interviewing another type of person, and the other one was what you ask them. Instead of who do you know? Hey, I know you know this person.
Right.
And you used relish, made me think of hot dogs. I would relish you putting me in touch with them. And the other one was just, you can be thinking of what type of influence does that person have? Is it possible that I could also be on their podcast if I invite them on mine because of reciprocity? What could I maybe do, an interview swap, or could I maybe do a shout out swap like you talked about in our very first interview together? A lot of really, really good things. I appreciate it. I could probably let you go, but if there's something else that you're dying to share about getting more clients through your podcast, would love to pull that in.
Yeah, just one last thing. So there are different people that I've interviewed on my own podcast, Profit with Podcasting, that I work with, who have done different strategies. Get creative, because ultimately you need to build a relationship with that person before you can ask for something. So maybe your podcast interview went really well, but you can sense that they're really not ready to have your trust to be working with you in a business relationship. I know people who develop entire 4 to 6 month long nurture sequences, whereas after their prospect appears on their podcast, they'll send them a free book with a recommended chapter that relates to something specific that that guest said in the interview. A few months later, they'll send them a like $200 framed quote, like this beautiful little home decor thing that they can put on a bookshelf, that it's a picture of the podcast logo with an actual quote that that guest said in the interview. Like, how cool is that? That's just really cool. So that nurture sequence, continuing to build relationships. And if you're slicing and dicing your content, like if you're working with somebody who's taking your podcast episodes and converting them into like blog articles or long form LinkedIn posts or YouTube videos, every time you take a snippet of that interview, tag the person on social media, because they're just going to be like, wow, in addition to that podcast, I'm now featured on the person's LinkedIn. I'm now featured on Twitter, YouTube, etc.
Noah, one thing that I notice about you, I know I've been on your podcast, and now you've been on this podcast 3 times, and I keep noticing it with you. And every time I have another interaction with you, it gets even more prevalent. It's like with a 50,000 downloads in 5 months episode, with the sponsorship episode, with this episode, the techniques that you use and implement are not always the easy button. They're not always the simple thing. They can take work. It's like you have to look to get the right people on your podcast, to get the right sponsors. You're like doing research to do interview swaps. You're researching, you're looking at this, you're typing in RSS feeds and the podcast name, and you're looking for emails, and you're connecting with people, and you're changing the templates just to play to the player and all of that. Yeah. It's like, no wonder you've had the success that you've had. It's because you take what you do seriously. And I think that that's a takeaway in and of itself for our listener who's heard all 3 of the episodes you've been on with this podcast. And we'll also link the episode that I was on in your show down below as well, so they can check that out. But I really want to say, you constantly don't just take the easy way out. You put in the time, you put in the work, you put in the effort, you figure it out. And I think that's what's made your podcast grow to 50,000 downloads. You monetize your podcast with sponsorship, and you monetize your podcast also by bringing in clients to your business. I want, and I hope that that is translated well to our listener today, who was thinking like, man, this is just going to be simple. I don't have to do anything. But if they do that extra work, like Grant Cardone and the 10X rule, if you've ever read that, if they push that work and effort in, I think they're going to get results just like you talked about in the last 3 episodes with us. Some of my takeaways today here are, oh my gosh, there's so many. Don't go around about sales the most painful way. Instead, take off your sales hat, invite your prospects onto your podcast. Once you've had anybody on your podcast, have them connected with other people. What the podcast interview itself should be by getting these prospects is highlighting them, and think broadly. So how can this relationship in some way benefit us both? And it doesn't just take overnight. It sometimes takes 1 to 6 months. And to get really good results, you can have a 6-month nurture sequence. I do have just one last question if you have enough time for it.
Please.
Should we interview our actual clients? Like with you, Noah, you help podcasters, and there's at least one podcaster that you have helped that has gotten great results because they work with you. Should you, or have you then had him or her as a guest on the podcast to kind of share their story and help it resonate with other listeners that were in their same shoes? So have you done it, and should we do it?
I have done it, and absolutely you should do it. I mean, the whole reason why we're looking for Google reviews and testimonial videos for our websites and so forth is because we want that social proof. And I can't think of a better way to get social proof than literally curating a 30-minute podcast interview that's engaging to listeners, and it's giving them like really impactful advice as to how to take their podcast, for example, to the next level. But then to literally implant in the listener's mind, this person, like everything that's coming out of their mouth is a result of them working with so-and-so. I totally recommend it, Adam.
Awesome. You have given us tons of tips. If you're listening and you have not yet checked out the first 2 episodes with Noah, They are going to be very beneficial to you, which also means you might want to check out his podcast. Don't worry. The link to his podcast is in the show notes. Scroll down right now and click. I'll let you go. Bye for now. This episode is brought to you by growyourshow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now and feel free to schedule a call with me and let's take your show to the next level. Again, growyourshow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.